Right. So with that, I just want to, officially start the webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. It should take about an hour or so of your time this evening about understanding the pathway to reimbursing drugs in Canada. My name is Lori Prue, and I am a part-time managing director with the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, or CAPA for short. I also live with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is something I bring to pretty much everything I do in this sort of patient world. And so we're here to bring together experts to help educate us, patients or people with lived experience or other health conditions, to learn about drug discovery and clinical trials in Canada. We've offered one webinar on that, which is available on YouTube, a second one focused on regulatory approval or the approval of drugs here in Canada by Health Canada. And now this one, we're shifting to understanding then, once it's approved, how or what is the pathway to reimbursing drugs in Canada. And so with that, I'll pass it to my co-moderator, Adam Kegley, who's co-hosting this webinar with us in terms of Global Healthy Living Foundation Canada, or Creaky Joints Canada. And he'll explain a little bit later what their organization is all about. But before I get started too much, I'd like to, especially because this is Indigenous History Awareness Month for the month of June in Canada. So I just wanted to do a brief land acknowledgement that, and I know we're all coming from different places here in Canada. I'm located in a place known as Ottawa, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation or the Algonquin peoples. I'd just like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. And I know we all come from different places, so just take a few seconds. You're welcome to add it to the chat, or just think it to yourself, to reflect on the land that you live, work, and play on out of respect to the Indigenous peoples where you are located. Just ever so briefly about CAPA, and then I will pass it over to Adam Kegley. We are a patient-driven and managed organization. Our board and staff, such as myself, all live with rheumatoid arthritis or other forms of arthritis. And just to explain briefly, the major sort of pieces of work that we do, one is on offering education and support. So I just put up the tile of that first webinar I mentioned about drug discovery and clinical trials. We advocate for patient perspectives and policies across Canada. And we're also very supportive and active patient partners engaged in research, as well as providing capacity building and training opportunities such as this to our community. And so you can learn a little bit more about all these different things that we do by visiting our website at www.arthritispatient.ca there on the bottom part of the slide. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Adam.
Thanks, Lori, and welcome to everyone for joining us. My name is Adam Kegley, and I'm the Associate Director of Global Partnerships at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, or GHLF. We're, of course, delighted to be co-hosting this webinar. It's the final one in our three-part series with our partners at CAPA on understanding the pathways to reimbursing drugs in Canada. For those who are tuning in for the first time, I'll just tell you a little bit about GHLF. Our mission is really to place chronic disease patients at the center of their own care by supporting them and those who care for them through education, advocacy, research, and support. Our organization initially focused on inflammatory arthritis, and we continue that work today, but we've also broadened our efforts to include a range of chronic conditions such as migraine, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, and many more. We manage global digital communities like Creaky Joints, providing educational content and resources for free. Specific sites like Creaky Joints Canada are available in English and French. Creaky Joints Australia and Creaky Joints Espanol, of course, in Spanish, cater to the diverse communities around the world. In Canada and also elsewhere around the globe, we've established patient councils that guide our education and advocacy efforts, comprised of patients' various chronic conditions. Among other activities in Canada, our collaboration with CAPA over the years has really been instrumental in our contributions to patient input submissions to the CDA, formerly CADIT, to help ensure patients have access to new innovative treatments that are reimbursable. We also provide disease-specific and omni-disease education that informs and gives tools to patients to really help them understand new innovative treatments or how best they might approach conversations with their doctor, etc. So in today's webinar, as Lori said, we were really aiming to hopefully simplify the complex process of drug reimbursement in Canada for you, and hope this helps you understand better how the process works and maybe a bit how you might be involved in these decisions. So I hope you find the webinar as informative as I know it will be. We'll be, of course, taking questions. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to pop those in the chat and we will get to those at the end in the Q&A section. Now I'll pass it back over to Lori to introduce our guest speakers.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So yeah, as Adam said, please note your questions in the chat. We'll be noting those. It's being recorded and it will be made available afterwards on the CAPA and Cricket Joint YouTube channels. Just a brief note that the webinar is intended for education information only and doesn't constitute medical advice. So you should always seek the advice of a physician. And so now to introduce our speakers, it'll be sort of in the order of starting with Dr. Matthew McDonald, followed by Dr. Mina Tadrous, finishing up with Linda Wilhelm, who is the CAPA President. So I might just start with introducing Dr. Matthew McDonald, who's the Acting Director of Pharmaceutical Policy and Health Technology Assessment as part of the Evidence Products and Services Business Unit at Canada's Drug Agency. He's been involved in launching the organization's non-sponsored reimbursement reviews and formulary management expert committee. So with that, I will pass it over to Matthew to share his slides. And while he's doing that, I'm just going to launch a quick poll just to gauge our understanding of how would you rate your level of knowledge about getting drugs reimbursed in Canada? So I'm trying to do this at the beginning and end of each of our webinars just to get a sense. So we'll ask you this very simple question at the beginning and at the end. So feel free to, we're not tracking any responses. This is really just for us to know globally whether it's helpful. So very little, intermediate, and I wrote the book about it. So I think 100% have answered. I'll share the poll results now so you could just get a quick sense as to where people are at in terms of their knowledge. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Matthew. Thanks so much.
Perfect, thank you. So can you see my slides okay? Yeah, okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for the warm kind of welcome, and I'm happy to be here this evening to speak to you a little bit about Canada's Drug Agency as well as health technology assessment and what its role really is in drug reimbursement in Canada. So as Lori noted, so my name is Matthew McDonald. I'm currently the Acting Director of Pharmaceutical Policy and HTA at Canada's Drug Agency. So I thought I'd just quickly start with who are we kind of as an organization? So Canada's Drug Agency is a pan-Canadian health organization. We were created and funded by Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and we're responsible for driving better coordination, alignment, and public value within Canada's drug and health technology landscape. And we provide Canada's health system leaders with independent evidence and advice so that they can make informed decisions about drugs, health technologies, as well as other issues within our health system. So just a quick outline here of my presentation this evening. So first, I was just going to start with what is health technology assessment and how is it related to reimbursement in Canada. Outline a little bit of the role of Canada's Drug Agency in the reimbursement review process, a little discussion around what are reimbursement reviews to begin with, what goes into a reimbursement review, and how can our different external partners be more involved in the process of a reimbursement review. And lastly, time permitting, I'd like to go over a few kind of ongoing initiatives within the organization where we're trying to improve access to different treatment options. So this first slide, so what is health technology assessment, known as HTA? Well, it's a multidisciplinary process that uses explicit methods to determine the value of a health technology, like a drug, at different points in its life cycle. But what I mean by that is it could be a new and innovative branded drug that's just entering the market, or it could also be an HTA can also be conducted later in the life cycle of a drug, perhaps in the post-market space, or even later on where generic entrants have also entered the market as well. So it can really occur at any point within that kind of spectrum. And there's a number of components that go into an HTA, but I really consider the biggest kind of components are a systematic evaluation of clinical and cost effectiveness of the drug or health technology. It considers economic and social impacts of the specific health technology under review. And it's a highly engaged process that we actively try and involve many external partners in the review, really trying to consider the perspectives from all our partners, such as patient groups, clinician groups, our different health system partners like the public drug programs, as well as industry. And the purpose is really to inform decision-making to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality healthcare system. So what exactly does Canada's Drug Agency do? So I mentioned that we're an HTA organization where we conduct HTA, and we complete work in a variety of health technology areas like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, as well as clinical interventions. And the types of questions that are addressed through our work, I kind of have some examples listed here on the slide. So, for example, how effective is a new drug compared to other treatments? Is it better than drugs that we already have? How accurate might a new diagnostic test be? Should a new product be reimbursed by public payers? Which patients would benefit most from a particular treatment? What's the appropriate price of a product? What are the costs associated with adopting a new technology, like a novel drug, as well as what are the barriers to implementing a new health technology? So Canada's Drug Agency conducts a number of different HTA reviews. So specifically for this evening and the purpose of this talk tonight around reimbursement of pharmaceuticals in Canada, I'm really focusing strictly on our reimbursement review process and procedure. So reimbursement reviews are a pan-Canadian process that provides reimbursement recommendations and advice to public-funded drug programs, with the exception of Quebec. And really the purpose of reimbursement reviews is to reduce duplication across the country, maximize the use of limited resources, and enhance the consistency of drug reviews, as well as reimbursement decisions. So as was kind of talked about at the beginning of the talk today, and that it's very sometimes complicated, and there's a lot of different agencies and organizations kind of involved in the process. So this slide's a little busy, but I'll try and break it down for everyone. So first and foremost, we obviously have Health Canada, so our regulatory body that's really looking at, is a new drug safe and does it work? And that's primarily what Health Canada's role kind of in this process. There's also the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, as well as our different public drug programs and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which you'll hear a little bit more about later this evening. And then in the middle here, what we have is Canada's Drug Agency. So really the core question of interest that we try and address through Canada's Drug Agency is, how does the new drug compare with existing treatment options? So I have some questions on this side. So we look at, what is the value of the new drug? Is it cost effective? Is it better than what we already have? If there's no existing treatments available, how does it compare with the current standard of care? Who does it work for? So is there a specific patient population that would benefit more for the new treatment? And what are the implementation issues? So implementation issues from a health human resource perspective, as well as locations of care. And our kind of review factors in a number of factors, as I talked about earlier, in terms of what an HTA is, but it really involves a clinical evidence appraisal, an economic analysis, as well as partner engagement to really try and represent patient, societal, and health system values in the process. So this slide looks at the reimbursement process and the reimbursement review process kind of at a high level. So starting on the far left, so what starts a reimbursement review process? What's the first catalyst? So most often this comes from a drug manufacturer where they submit either concurrently with Health Canada or shortly after their submission to Health Canada, they submit to CDA for a reimbursement recommendation. And that's where most of the reimbursement reviews start. However, different tumor groups or public drug programs can also initiate reimbursement reviews. And then once we get that submission for a reimbursement review, as an organization, we conduct our health technology assessment. Very early on in the process, we try and engage with all our external partners in the process. So this includes our health system partners, like our public drug programs, but also our patient and clinician groups as well. So what is considered in the CDA review? So there's a clinical review where we look at randomized control trials, any indirect treatment comparisons, or any other evidence. There's an economic review where we look at a sponsor's economic model and appraise it. We look at budget impact analyses, as well as any published economic evaluations that are already available. Depending on the review, there could be an ethics component, so identifying any ethical considerations for the drug under review, as well as considering that input I mentioned earlier from external partners. So that being patients and or caregivers, clinical specialists, clinician groups, as well as our public drug programs. So how is patient input used in the reimbursement review process and the HTA? It's really to better understand the impact of an illness on a person's life and try and appreciate the goals of treatment and what it means for these to be met or missed by the person with lived experience. Also to explore if the clinical and economic evidence within our review addresses patients' needs. We also use patient input to help us interpret clinical trial results, to identify important evidence gaps, and also to identify, use equity and ethical considerations, and also to contribute evidence outside of clinical trials. And I have included a hyperlink here where you can take a look at how you can be more involved in the reimbursement review process. So once we've kind of received input from our different external partners, we've conducted our review, what happens next? So this is the yellow box here. So as an organization, we have a number of different arm's length expert committees that ultimately put forth our reimbursement recommendations. So these are a collection of experts that would review the health technology assessment that's put together by CDA with input from clinical experts, as well as we have a patient member that's involved in the expert committee deliberation as well. And then they deliberate on the evidence and ultimately put out a reimbursement recommendation. So this slide also has it's a little text heavy, but I just wanted to highlight a little bit of what components go into a deliberation and a reimbursement recommendation. So first, the clinical evidence, really looking at the effectiveness and safety compared to other standard of care options. From an economic perspective, looking at the long-term value of the drug under review, as well as any patient, societal, health system, ethical, and other value considerations. And I have a number of those listed here. For example, unmet medical need, or patients' goals for treatment and life goals related to education, work, or family life. There's a number of different expert committees that review our reimbursement reviews. We have the Canadian Drug Expert Committee that reviews innovative non-oncology drugs. We have the PCODER Expert Committee that reviews our oncology drugs. There's a subcommittee that reviews our plasma protein products. And then what's a relatively new expert committee that was launched last year, where we can actually also have post-market reimbursement review recommendations. So this committee looks at drugs that have already been on the market for an extended period of time in Canada and provide an avenue to potentially have reimbursement recommendations for older drugs. The output of a reimbursement recommendation has 3 categories. So it could be reimburse, reimburse with conditions, or do not reimburse. So conditions, for example, could be identifying a specific population of patients that would benefit most from the drug under review, or potentially identifying the most cost-effective treatment as well. And just wanted to highlight as well that recommendations help guide funding decisions, but they are non-binding, and the final funding decisions do remain the responsibility of each public drug program. And lastly, I just got a couple more minutes. I just wanted to highlight a couple ongoing initiatives within the organization where we're trying to improve access to new treatment options. So the first I wanted to talk about was the time-limited recommendations, which is something new that we've started to conduct at Canada's Drug Agency. And in this situation, it really falls into a bucket of drugs that receive a notice of compliance from Health Canada. So it's approved to be marketed in Canada. However, it's a conditional authorization to market the drug. And it's really the condition is that the sponsor must undertake additional studies to verify the clinical benefit of the drug. So in these situations, we can review these NOCC drugs under a time-limited recommendation framework to really try and help ensure timely access to promising new therapies and ensure recommendations reflect the currently available evidence when drugs have received this conditional approval. And time-limited recommendations would be issued in favor of reimbursement and contingent on a future reassessment of the evidence as it matures. And we'll really look at a small subset of files for a starting point, and then hopefully broaden this as we go forward. Lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our Formulary Management Expert Committee. So as I mentioned, this was an expert committee that was added from the organization last year. And this expert committee provides reimbursement recommendations in the post-market space. So not new novel drugs, but drugs that have been around a little longer. And what's also interesting about this expert committee specifically is we're really trying to be innovative and really try and pilot new concepts in which how we conduct our reviews. So both, how we conduct our reviews from what does the review look like? How does the committee deliberate? What is the process for deliberation? External partner input. So how can we involve our external partners more in the process? So one initiative that we trialed through FMEC last year was having a person with lived experience present directly to the expert committee so that they can share their story on living with the disease and condition and what outcomes are most important to them. Also, we're looking at our kind of output. So what does the final review look like? How can we be more short and concise and in a more digestible report that is understanding from everyone? And we really wanted to focus on transparency across all these innovations. So how can we be more transparent in how we conduct our reviews and how our committees deliberate and how we ultimately arrive at our final reimbursement recommendations? So that's everything that I have this evening, but happy to answer any questions whenever that time comes.
Sure. Thank you so much, Matthew. I think that's been really informative to explain the steps in the process. We'll do like a question and answer at the end so we can kind of get to everybody. But I just thought I'd do a last plug for your FMEC process, that there was vasculitis medication that is currently being reviewed, and that is part of that non-sponsored review. And for many of you, vasculitis is a form of arthritis. And so it's for esophageal granulomatosis with polyangiitis. I know it's like a mouthful, EGPA for short. So it's nice to see the process has evolved, and happy to support that in whatever way is helpful. All right, thanks so much. And with that, I'm going to maybe ask Mina to come up, and you could share your presentation while I'm introducing you, if you don't mind. So Dr. Mina Tadrous is an assistant professor at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto, and is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in real world evidence and pharmaceutical policy. He also completed a pharmacy residence in drug information and health outcomes at the University of Tennessee and St. Jude's Children's Hospital, Research Hospital, rather. So with that, I mean, I'll just pass it over to you, Mina. He's been a great supporter of CAPA, and so I'm really glad that you're here today to explain the rest of the market access and drug reimbursement journey.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
So
And thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here to talk to one of my, my favorite groups that we've had a lot of fun working with. And so what I want to build on is the awesome talk that Matthew just gave around what CDA's role is, which is very pivotal to what's happening. And so some of this is going to overlap, and I'm going to try to hit it from a different angle. But really, I want to just fill in some of the gaps that are left around what happens in the different spaces. And the way that I sort of think about it, when I think about the drug life cycle, and you heard Matthew use that term, you just think about how things flow through from the point that it's being discovered in drug development, and it's being passed forward into going for the NOC that we just talked about from Health Canada, and going through that regulatory review to have its efficacy and safety being assessed, to the submission of the payers. There's this sort of market exclusivity that occurs, that company gets to be the only company that produces that drug. And so they kind of want to flow through this as fast as possible. But there are lots of handoffs that are really important to consider that allow, not just for the drug to enter the Canadian market, but for somebody to pay for it. And we're going to try to touch on those. We're going to use the public market, which is sort of the most well-defined in Canada, and has sort of been the most mature, for lack of a better term, in how it's being developed. Then we'll talk a little bit about private, because I think that's really important for a vast majority of Canadians in the current landscape, especially with certain drugs, to be thinking through that. Sorry, it's more animated than I thought. I should have been snapping through this. So the first thing I want to talk about is what are the funding roles that happen there. So as I mentioned, Health Canada evaluates the safety and efficacy and the quality of data to assess the potential benefits and risks of the drug. So often Health Canada will align with the FDA, and you will see drugs. And one of the things that's very frustrating for Canadians is that we know that drugs will go to the FDA first, and then they'll come to Health Canada. And a common misnomer is that, Health Canada is slower, or there's something happening there. But the reality is that when pharmaceutical companies at a global level are making decisions, they often hit the larger markets first. And so the FDA, being the US market, is one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. And so they kind of enter there first. And so they use these pivotal clinical trials that you'll hear about to hit that point up. Matthew's talked extensively about CADIS, which I should now be putting on CDA, embarrassingly, is the independent not-for-profit that makes a focus on cost effectiveness, and they do a lot of that work there. There is another piece that's called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which I'll dive into a little bit more. But how does this life cycle look? So you can imagine a company just got its NOC, so it's got access to the Canadian market. They can't quite sell yet. There's a few interesting things that happens in Canada that sets us apart from our US colleagues. And one of the biggest points that we want to talk about is something called the PMBRB, the Patented Medicines Review Board. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And they are super important because, frankly, it's what sets us apart from our US colleagues. And so although we don't think about it as how something gets listed on the formulary, prior to market entry, all drugs, the vast majority of new drugs, have to go through a separate kind of parallel process for the PMPRB. From the public payer angle, once a drug gets Health Canada approval, it'll depending on which provinces it wants to go to, it'll go to INES, which is the HTA agency for Quebec, or it'll go to the CDA, formerly CADIF, for entering most of the other provinces and territories. Once that review is sort of done for any new agent or drug, that's when it'll go to the PCPA, and we'll talk about what that is, to be kind of negotiated at a pan-Canadian level. Remember, Canada is a confederation, and so although Health Canada federally allows drugs to enter the market, healthcare delivery is at a provincial and territorial level. And so decisions on what drugs to pay for are based at the province level, especially for the public drug programs. That doesn't mean the private plans have to abide by that, but this is for any public funding that goes towards drugs. And then from the PCPA, it'll go towards the provincial formulary listing. And we'll talk about what that means in the sense of a formulary and a listing. And I think it's important to recognize some of those. The private payer sector works a little bit differently, where pretty much once something gets Health Canada approval, they can start, being listed by private payers. Now, we've seen a very big shift in this marketplace where it sort of used to be, and frankly, like I've talked to some folks who are in this space, that the moment something got Health Canada approval, it was automatically listed on private payers. Those days are gone. This is very much shifted, and we'll talk about that at the very end if we have some time. So the PMBRB, I want to start there because it's a really important nuance that people forget about that is uniquely Canadian. So the PMBRB was founded in 1987 as a consumer protection body through the Patent Act. It has a dual mandate. It protects consumers by ensuring that prices of patented medicines are not excessive and provide reporting on pharmaceutical trends. The Patent Act was amended to strengthen the Patented Review Board, and it extended patent exclusivity period of medicines, and policy markers believed it would be more favorable to investment for R&D. PMBRB would regulate ceiling prices, the highest price that could be sold in Canada. Bluntly, and I don't know, this is the story I give most of my American colleagues because I do a lot of work comparing Canadian and US drug prices. When a drug comes in the US, they can, and I hate to pick on our colleague, our neighbors to the south, but I think it's the world's biggest market, and it pays a lot of attention to our space, and the contrast is pretty stark. When a drug company comes in, they can, and they get FDA approval, which is the equivalent of Health Canada, they can ask for any price they want. Doesn't mean anyone has to pay it, but theoretically they can pick any price tag that they want, especially during the period that they have exclusive access to the market. In Canada, because we're giving them that piece, there was sort of an understanding that you couldn't just excessively ask for any price that you wanted whatsoever. And so there's this regulation that says that we have to figure out what a fair price is and put at least a ceiling cap on it. This is not the price that the insurance companies are paying. This is not the price that the provinces are paying. This is sort of, if you can imagine, the sticker price that's publicly noted. And if you walked into a pharmacy and you had to pay in cash completely, this is the price that would be there. So in this day and age, it was very different when this was founded, but in this day and age, this is the board that's sort of protecting what those prices would be for cash paying patients, or if you had to pay for something out of pocket. It also protects against companies selling their drug and then one person raising the prices exuberantly. If you remember a few years ago, there was this infamous character named Martin Shkreli who bought a drug and then just jacked up the prices. And, the hope is that it would sort of protect from some of those mechanisms. Now, more recently, PMBRB has been all over the news because they drafted guidelines on how to regulate excessive pricing. Pricing continued to rise, and so they wanted to reform some of these things. And this was a good chance for us to look at some of the mechanisms they use. The ceiling price was largely based on setting a median price of reference countries. So what basically the rule was, is they would take a basket of equal countries and say that we don't want to pay any higher than the median there. But what they wanted to do is modernize that a bit and change some of the countries in there. They also wanted to change the way that they would figure out what the price would be and other factors that would go into there. Now, this did end up going to court, saying that this was outside of the mandate. And there was sort of like a middle ground that was faced, but the federal court and the Quebec courts pushed back and said that only the provincial governments are constitutionally empowered to regulate prices, and the PMBRB can only regulate prices if there's a patent abuse. And so the courts did allow them to change the reference basket, so they were able to drop the US and drop, I think it was Switzerland, but I could be corrected on that. But basically these really high countries that were pulling the median up, and these new amendments came into place. But again, the PMBRB is there as a mechanism to protect against that ceiling price for anyone who's not going through the regular mechanisms of public or private. And there are still Canadians, we know this. This is why we have a debate about pharmacare and catastrophic drug programs and things like that, that do rely on paying things out of pocket or may need to come here and purchase things. A large component, and Matthew talked about this a little bit, is about cost effectiveness analyses. So I just wanted to briefly introduce this because this becomes really important. And I think that what I want you guys to realize is the problem in this space is you have a person who's invented and spent a lot of money to try to bring a drug to market. They took risks. And so they want to pick a price that returns their investment, returns money to their investors. And honestly, that's a very fair assumption. That's why we give them a market exclusive. If they do get access to the market, they get a period of time where they can make some of those returns back. The problem is that their pricing is not based on a value. The pricing is often based on what a market can bear. And that's what most of the literature points to. What have their competitors been able to get, and what does that mean? If you're an insurance company or you're a payer or you're a government, you really don't want to pay just what a company asks. And I hope we can all agree that if I showed up in a marketplace and someone just said, I have the only jar of pickles here, and I want to pick a price that's there, they shouldn't just be able to pick what they ask. You should be able to assess what the value is. And so cost effectiveness in the HTA process is a tool to assess that value. It's a place to try to find a fair value of what that would mean. Making sure that the company gets paid for the innovation that they produced, making sure that they have a return. It's not just on paying the cost of the drug. They took a risk. And so it is okay for them to make a profit, and it is okay for them to make that amount. But I think it's trying to figure out what that would mean. And so lots of the amazing work that CDA does and other health economists do is they work through these things that are like complicated models. But generally, I don't want to drown you in this, but what they're trying to figure out is as a person goes through their disease and lives with this disorder, using data and inputs into it, including the cost and clinical outcomes, can we figure out what this ICER ratio is? And this is sort of an idea of like, what is the cost per how well I can make somebody's life? And is it actually worth it? And this is and there's huge limitations, and we can have a whole debate about this evening, but this is the attempt to make things fair across the board. And sometimes it falls short, and sometimes it's really great. And the idea here is that it's really hard, even if you think about the people sitting around this table that live and have to suffer with different diseases or know that they're going to have different things in their life in the future. Each person's experience is different. And it's really hard to say that one life or quality adjusted life year is very different from another. But what we try to do is use real data that comes from the lived experience of people and then the true cost coming from the real world to adjust them and figure out some sort of ratio that helps us figure out what that value is. And by using this value or this ICER, we can then think about a fair price. And that fair price starts the negotiation. It's not always the price everyone lands on, but it's at least a place where we can agree. It's not the price that the company is asking for because they kind of just, pulled it from where they think the market can bear. And it's not what the government wants to pay because that's probably closer to zero. And so it's a place to at least start negotiating. And why am I talking about all of this? Because that's really important to consider when the drug finally goes through the CDA process, a recommendation is made, and then it goes to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or PCPA, is a table that all the provinces sit at together, and they negotiate the drug prices together. And funny enough, this seems very logical, right? The more people you have, the better price you have. You just got to go on Alibaba and see that if you try to order a box of 100, you get a better deal than if you order a box of 10, right? This is a very, I think, intuitive thing that makes sense, but it actually is pretty new to Canada. For years, every province was kind of negotiating on their own, and the bigger provinces were getting decent deals, and the smaller provinces were taken to the wash. And so the idea was that together they can actually get much better prices. And that's pretty much proven to be very, very true when they've done some of their analyses. And so, one of these things, again, is this willingness to pay. And generally, most, depending on the disease space, it comes in and around 50 to 100,000, but this can vary quite a bit depending on the country and the nuance. And to be honest, depending on the disease space and if there's certain things. But it's a mechanism in which we try to introduce fairness to at least allow us an ability to compare things across from each other. So once it's negotiated, they can negotiate a few different things, right? They can have different types of deals. They can negotiate a fixed discount or a rebate. This is the most common thing. They pay a certain price, and then the government gets a certain price of money back. They can get price volume agreements, depending if they buy certain volumes. They could get free goods. There's cap models. There's outcome-based agreements. And they can come up with a lot of creative things to make sure that it fits in the budget, but at the same time is at a price that is cost-effective or close to what they were reasonably willing to pay. Once it goes through that Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance negotiation, you can see here it starts in Health Canada, goes to the Common Drug Review, goes to the PCPA, and then there's an agreement and it goes to every single provincial review, and then the provinces will make a funding decision that aligns with what they agreed upon at the table at the PCPA, and they'll add it to their own formularies. So I have a feeling everyone here is pretty familiar with this, but a formulary, again, is the final goal for all drugs because it's the list of medications that a payer, public or private, is willing to pay for. Hospitals have their own formularies. It's a little bit different and outside of the scope of what we want to talk about today. And formularies are used as a way to control costs, but also to communicate what that payer is willing to pay for. And it can include criteria for use. So it can be a general use that anyone can get access to it, but it can also be limited to certain patients based on other treatments, disease severity, specific indications, and it can also list how long a medication can or will be reimbursed. And most provinces vary a little bit from each other, but they generally float around the same kind of three buckets that they put things into. The first is its general formulary. Anyone who gets it prescribed who's covered by that payer will get it. The second is a step therapy or a specific code. In Ontario, this is called a limited use code. You have to meet certain clinical criteria. The third is a prior authorization. This is when your doctor or your prescriber or your nurse practitioner has to send in a form to make sure that you get that drug paid for. And that's sort of and they kind of step in more, nuance and more complexity as it goes there. So we've talked quite a bit about public payers in that process. Now, the private payers, we touched on it a little bit. You kind of just flow through it quickly, but there are some nuances there that we want to bring up. So the private payer space has really changed quite a bit. And it varies so much within plans. And it's not just which insurance plan you're in. So if you're with Manulife or Sun Life or Green Shield, even within those, depending on how you're getting it paid for, there could be tons of plans. So it's a very intimidating process because you could be at a person next to you could be a Green Shield and you're both at Green Shield, but you have different formularies or you have slightly different plans. And so this becomes a little bit more complicated to navigate and shift through the way they cover drugs. We're starting to see more and more insurers in the private space do cost shifting. We're starting to see them, especially for high cost biologics and drugs, they start shifting over to the public program. So we're starting to see this dynamic between private and public. Prior authorization, which wasn't that common before, is becoming much more common. And then the last thing that we're starting to see more and more of, and I'm happy to expand on this, is you saw in the news more and more pharmacy networks, where if you're with a certain insurance company, you have to go to a specific pharmacy, especially for specialty drugs, which are often high-cost drugs or biologic drugs. And so the private insurance space is starting to amalgamate, starting to be a little bit more involved in pricing negotiations and things like that. But it's funny enough, a little bit behind the public programs, but it's a little bit more black box in the way that we help navigate it. So I hope that's been a quick crash course on everything that happens in the rest of the life cycle of the drugs. I will say a quick plug that we do have a podcast that kind of walks through this from the pharmacy school, all the way from drug discovery to when we pay for drugs through a pharmacoeconomic lens. But thank you again for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, thank you so much, Mina. It's been great and it covers lots of ground, that's for sure, especially, the hot topic of the pharmacy networks for sure and the impact on people taking, medications for rheumatic disease drugs, which can often be so expensive. So anyways, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Linda Wilhelm, who we'll just sort of speak generally to patient input processes across the board. I mean, Linda is the president of the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, and everything I've learned in life about pharmaceutical policy, I probably have to attribute to Linda. So with that, I will pass it over to you.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of patient engagement in health technology assessment in Canada. And I'm going to begin with what I call the dark ages, which were the late 1990s, early 2000s, before the Canada Drug Agency, before the Canadian Agency of Drugs and Technologies in Health, we had the Canadian Coordinating Office of Health Technology Assessment. There was no patient engagement, no role for patient engagement within that organization at the time. The leadership of the organization didn't see any role for patients in that organization and was very public in her opinions about that. I was not doing well. I have rheumatoid arthritis, very severe. I was kind of at the end of the line in 1999, and I needed a new medication. And people making health technology assessment decisions at that time didn't believe that rheumatoid arthritis was a serious enough a disease to get approved, for me to get approved for special access. So, or to review our drugs in a timely manner, that these new drugs, biologics that Mina had spoke about, that really transform lives for people living with our disease. So it really resulted in a lack of trust on my behalf in the health technology assessment decision-making process. But fast forward almost a decade, CODA has now become the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, and they begin accepting input from patients. The Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance was actually one of the first patient organizations to participate in a CAPA therapeutic review. They were reviewing biologics, the cost effectiveness of biologics for people living with rheumatoid arthritis. Their review concluded that these drugs were not cost effective for people living with this disease, and our organization disputed as a partner in that therapeutic review. We actually disputed those results, and a second review actually concluded that they were cost effective for patients who did not respond to the older medications, which was all we really wanted at the time. The older medications had been used for 30, 40 years. Their safety profile, their efficacy was well known. The biologics were new, and as we know that new drugs can come with new side effects and new issues. So we really just needed these drugs to be available for the patients who really needed them. So that was kind of our first experience with CADIS. And then the next milestone was just not even a couple years later, there was the acceptance of the patient input into the common drug review process. So it was very limited. It was limited to a specific narrow template that I think mostly is still being used now. A pretty heavy declaration of conflict of interest, but many patient groups didn't fully adhere to those conflict of interest. And despite recommendations on a number of occasions from other patient groups on ways to improve that transparency, I think the process remains largely unchanged. Patient groups' motives being called into question about where we get our funding from, the funding sources, and there was huge issues. And then there came the recruitment of public members to the Canadian Drug Evaluation Committee, the committee that reviewed drugs for the Common Drug Review. But many of the knowledgeable patients who've been engaged for a decade or more were excluded because we were also advocating for access to treatments that we needed. And only organizations were allowed to submit at that time. So individual patients were not allowed to submit. And, we had wanted to actually to move towards in-person presentations to the committee. And now we're seeing that they do have a committee that actually accepts in-person patients talking about their disease experience. I think we'd like to see it go further, where the patients can actually address the committee that's reviewing the drugs when there are issues or concerns that come up. Then CADA came out with the travel awards for patients to attend their annual symposium, and gradual improvements came to make the symposium a patient-included conference and very patient-friendly. And recently, now we're the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health has now become the Canada Drug Agency, has opened up for patients and clinicians to present to the committee on their disease experience. But again, I'd like to see that actually expand further. CADA now has a patient advisory committee, and things are vastly improved. We hope that things will continue to improve. And a couple of recommendations that I would like to see happen is that patient organizations can actually meet with this patient advisory committee about issues they have about medications that are being reviewed or that they need. Expand the in-person presentation to include more than just a disease experience, but to actually present to the review committee. And patient representation on the Canada Drug Agency board, not just public members, but people who have lived experience with the healthcare system, with living with diseases. It's a very different perspective than somebody who's a public member who doesn't have that experience of the healthcare system and living with a chronic or long-term condition. Support for patient input submissions. Our organization, CAPA, is a very small organization. It takes a lot of resources for us to prepare a submission. And lately, we've been lucky. We've been partnering with Creaky Joints and Adam and Global Healthy Living Foundation and the Arthritis Society and different groups. And that's made it a little bit easier. But there is really no resources. We use our own resources often at the side of our desk. I know CAPA, we're volunteer, and we have Lori 10 hours a week. That's not a lot. I think she could probably do a lot more than 10 hours a week. So I think, to provide resources to help patient groups with those submissions. And the last recommendation is a need to broaden the patient representation to include new people, not just the same voices, including mine. My voice doesn't always need to be there. We need to have different voices, diverse voices, new people, making sure we're representing the authentic patient voice and not necessarily an organization that is speaking on behalf of a patient community, which I've seen happen a lot. So a few recommendations that I think would improve the processes. There's probably more, but the ones I think that I've brought forward would not be all that difficult to implement. So I'm going to leave it there and with that, and no PowerPoint or anything for everybody, and let everybody go to questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thank you to Mina and Matthew as well. I would like to open it up for questions. We have received several, and I think I would kick off with one in particular that I believe was for Matthew, which was, are there any considerations regarding the limited ODB coverage of allergy medications, thinking about intranasal corticosteroids and combinations, and considering the burden of allergic rhinitis?
Sure, yeah, thank you very much for that question. So I can't speak specifically to individual drug programs and some of the considerations that they might be going through, but I can highlight that we actually have a reimbursement review right now that's active for seasonal allergic rhinitis. And the patient input period is currently open for that as well. So just to highlight that. for everyone in attendance as well. So it's not directly addressing the intranasal corticosteroids, but it does kind of provide an opportunity to provide that kind of perspective on access to all drugs that might treat seasonal rhinitis.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And could you just remind people how they might get involved in that patient input submission? Could they do that themselves, or is it through a patient organization like ours or CAPA's?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, we ask that it's best to kind of engage with a patient organization. If you are not familiar of one, you can reach out, and our engagement team would be happy to point you in the direction of a group that might already be putting together input or feedback on the review. And it's always better, Linda highlighted the kind of resourcing constraints sometimes to submit these input for all the different reviews. So I think, if a collaborative approach is always the best approach. So if you're not actively engaged with any organizations, you can definitely reach out to our engagement team, and they can help with facilitating getting your input considered in the process. And I'll pop a link in the chat as well for some specific information on that.
Thanks, Matthew. That'd be great. And I would just say as well, I think we mentioned earlier in the chat that you're more than welcome to get in touch with myself or Linda or Lori, and we can also help facilitate that too. If there's any relevant input submissions that we're doing or that you would want us to do, we're happy to take a look at that and provide your input into those as well. So thanks again, Matthew. I'll try to alternate between the speakers. We have several questions. So the next one I'd say is for Mina. During your presentation, you spoke about that sticker price, and we're wondering, do people without insurance pay the sticker price?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think, I got a question from somebody else on the side here as well, like around that. So I think one of the challenges is that if you were to compare the price that you walk into a pharmacy, let's walk into a pharmacy and you ask we'll use Ontario because that's where I practice as a pharmacist, and you ask what the ODB price is. So it's $1 a pill. We know that the government has likely negotiated, especially if it's a newer product, a price in the background where they'll pay that $1 and then they're going to get a rebate in the background. It could be 50 cents, it could be 10 cents. We don't really know. It's actually top secret. You are covered, so you're largely going to only pay your copay and then a small amount. A private insurance person is going to experience the same thing, and that pharmacy is going to likely charge $1 as well. Now you walk in, you're paying out of pocket. Oh, and that private insurer probably also has a rebate now as well, and they have some sort of deal in the background as well. Now you walk in and you're paying out of pocket, you're going to get charged $1, but the reality is that no one except you is paying that $1. And I think that's what's very frustrating. And one of the conversations that's been happening around the pharmacare piece is that that's not exactly what's happening. Now, I will say, with just leaving that out, that's not where the story kind of ends, and something we didn't talk about quite a bit. There are things to help people, just to be fully transparent about it. So the first thing is, from a public perspective, every province has something called a catastrophic drug program. They're structured a little bit differently depending on where they work, but the idea is that if your own personal payment of a drug surpasses a certain amount of your income, so in Ontario, it's in and around 4% divided into quarters. So if you make $50,000, or say, let's do the math easy. So you make $10,000, it would be around $400, and then that would be divided into different quarters. And then once you surpass that threshold of deductible, the government steps in and starts paying for you, and you're covered by the public drug program. And this it's a little different in every province, so you have to kind of look at what happens in every province. And so that's there to support you. The other thing is that there's also a lot of cards that are called discount cards that your doctor can give you to get you to have a lower price if you're paying out of pocket. There's also the drug programs and the companies themselves. So if you ever are in a situation where you have to pay for a drug out of pocket, the first thing I would probably do is also contact the company and see if they have any supports for you to try to get access as well. Or, reach out to patient organizations like CAPA and find out if there are mechanisms that they know how to help you navigate. And so it is a very daunting process. I know this is a very long answer, but the reality is that the sticker price that you pay is unfavorable to people who have to pay out of pocket. We argue that it's a really small number of Canadians, but to that person who's paying that, it doesn't matter how many other people are doing it. It really hurts. But there are other mechanisms, and I'm happy to talk about more of them, including the public path, the private path, and then getting supports through patient programs. Long answer, but I hope that that's helpful to people.
No, thanks, Mina. I think it really is. And I think that's something that is on a lot of people's minds, especially what happens if there's a temporary period where they're without insurance, or whether they're regularly without insurance. I think it's an important thing to address. So thank you for doing that. And Linda, I'll just jump to you really quick as well, and would say after your presentation, there was a question, where do you see the future going with lived experience submissions for reviews like the ones that are out there right now?
Well, I gave a few of my recommendations. I'm hoping we will continue this evolution. As I said, we started in the dark ages and we've come quite a ways, and it can get discouraging when you look at, the last 2 years, right? But you always have to look at the long game and things. And so a big shift in the last 20 years that, I don't think that patients are going away. I think we're going to continue to push the Canada Drug Agency to improve their patient engagement process to the point where we have open meetings like the FDA has, where you can go in and hear the deliberations. And, obviously there'll be closed discussions as well, but, at least portions of the meetings would be open to patients attending or the public attending. And a way for patients to bring further. I mean, as CAPA, we have done that. We've gone to CADA if we've had issues with a decision that was made to get further clarification, and they've been very open to us and working with us. We've had pretty good relationship with them. So I just think it's just we build more, we continue to build the trust, we continue to build those relationships, and patient engagement's growing. It's not going away. So I am positive for the future. It just it does take time for these processes to change. People kind of get stuck in their ruts and get stuck in where they are, and they need to kind of open it up to more.
Thanks, Linda. And I couldn't agree more. And I think it's, webinars like this that also are, continued steps in the right direction, collaborating like this all together. So really appreciative of that. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I did just want to try and do a couple more questions if people would bear with me. And then those we don't get to, we do have, I think, everybody's email addresses from the registration. So I've recorded those questions and we'll send out all the responses if our wonderful participants are willing to answer those as follow-ups later on. So we can send all of those out to you. But I do just want to try and cover a couple more questions. One is back to Matthew in your presentation. Could you just explain a little bit more about why cost effectiveness is so important when it comes to the drug approval and reimbursement process?
Sure, yeah, and I think Mina might have a little bit to add on as well, but I think why it's so important, I think the most kind of simple answer is really just looking at value. And the question is really, how does reimbursing a specific drug under review provide value in the long term? And that's really what cost effectiveness is ultimately looking at. And so it's really just that. I always think about it just in terms of value to the system, because we only have limited resources. So we have to have some sort of system, some sort of process in place to look at which new drugs provide the most value to the system.
Thank you for that. And Mina, did you have anything to add on that note?
No, I think that's kind of like the best way to put it. I think the struggle that everybody has is what I was trying to get at in my short spiel, was that where do you start? Someone shows up and asks for a specific price, and that's great and all. They're the owner of that patent and they have the right to ask for whatever price they have. But I, as a payer and a taxpayer, don't want to just pay the price that any company asks for it, if we're going to be honest. And so, but I also don't want to like try to rip them off. Like, we're not trying to like hold our patients hostage in a way that they don't get treatments that they need. And so this is the struggle that governments and payers are in. They want to find that fair value to pay that company what's right, what's right. And I think the bigger struggle that adds to this nuance, like it's great to think about value, is that frankly, not all drugs are blockbusters. So in my career, I've seen some drugs that are incredible. Like when I finished pharmacy school, I never thought we would see a hepatitis cure, or we would see the psoriasis response we see with some of these newer medications, or we would see some of the amazing responses that happen with biologics. But we also have drugs that come out that are the exact same as another drug that just came out 3 years ago, and they're asking for the same price or double the price for marginal, and sometimes some drugs barely work, like they work better than placebo, but is that really our bar? And so I think the nuance of how well something works is really important. And I think the last thing to think about is like, we do have a limited amount of resources, and the budget is outpacing every other healthcare spending budget. And that's a real stressor to make sure as many patients, and I don't want to say that if we give one person drugs, we don't give it to another. That's not how it works. But in a reality, it's like, I think we have to be conscious of these budgets and how things are going in the pricing world. So it's about being fair, in my opinion.
Thanks,
And,
Mina.
and Adam,
Yeah,
I think
please.
I'm just going to add, though, I mean, that was part of the issue that I had. So the government paid for 14 total joint replacement surgeries for me. I spent months and months and months, 3.5 months, but every year I spent a month in hospital. But because of the silo of the healthcare system, all they looked at was the drug budget. They didn't look at the fact that now I am disabled, so I can no longer work and pay taxes. I can't adequately take care of my children. I can't, I'm using the healthcare system to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And yet the biologics would have prevented all that. And back then, when they were first approved, all of that was ignored, which was probably why I had this not fully trusting in the drug review system. So I think that makes the case for why we need to have patients at the table to actually tell these stories and to collaborate with, to show that, yes, there's the drug budget, but there's the hospital budget, there's the primary care budget, there's all these others, there's a long-term care budget, disability budget. None of that is, I don't even think now that the disability or long-term care is even taken into consideration. And that's where I would have spent the last 25 years.
Thanks for that, Linda. I think it's really important to point out. And just to say, there was, I think, I know we're running short on, we're over time already, so I would just pose maybe one question that anybody could answer in this, which is, what would you consider to be one of the most important things, or some of the most important things a patient can do if they want to get involved in any of these processes?
Yeah, I can go first. So I think the best way to get involved, I think first and foremost is, engage with any organizations that you're already engaged with. You start to learn, I think, that it's a big, complicated process, I feel like at times, reimbursement, but it's also a relatively small world as well. So I think, engaging with organizations that have experience will definitely go a long way in terms of, how do you get involved with a reimbursement review? Like if you're just coming in fresh, like it's very hard to even determine, how much value your input might add. So I think, reaching out to organizations like this one, I think is a great first step. And if you're not sure, there's also on our website, there is an opportunity to reach out to our engagement team, and we can help point you in the right direction of some active organizations in this space as well that can help you kind of contribute more to the process. And
Thanks,
then
Matthew.
before, I'll just add I'm going to add one link into the chat, Linda, just based on your kind of discussion there around costs outside of public drug programs. We recently launched just earlier this year, and we're going to start piloting, looking at other societal perspectives in our economic evaluations, like you mentioned. So I'll just pop that in the chat for your information as well.
That's great. Thank you. Mina, Linda, anything to add before we wrap?
I would love to answer this question. I feel like
Please, go ahead.
probably the expert. I'll let her have the last word because she's obviously the one that should be talking about this the most. So for us, from a researcher's perspective and a person who does policy research, we're always trying to find people to collaborate with. And that's the way I view my patient partners. Like I want to have members on my team, depending on the projects that we do. So with the ODPRN, the Ontario Drug Policy Research Network, we have this amazing group called the Citizens Panel, who help inform a lot of our work and are actually part of our steering committee on what questions we should be asking. They're just wonderful. And so if you're in Ontario, this is a plug. We would love to have more people on board, but also as we launch projects. So if there's a specific area that you're interested in and you see a researcher online or something, you know what? I would just shoot them a message. You'd be surprised. We always struggle to find patient partners, and there's more funding to support it nowadays. Like things have changed quite a bit in the last 5 to 10 years from when we started first having patient partners and we had to like find budget on the side of our desks to now it's become a standard that you have to pay for patients to be there and respect their time and their contributions. And so, there is opportunities. And so I wouldn't be shy about it. And if anyone is interested in it, you could just reach out to me and I'd be happy. If it's not with our team, I'd be happy to connect you and be that catalyst up. You'd find a research team or any organization that would, greatly benefit from your insights and lived experiences.
Thanks, Mina. Linda?
Yeah, I mean, sign up for our newsletter. CAPA's always looking for patient partners. We provide opportunities quite frequently for patient partners to engage in research projects. So, check out, sign up for our newsletter. You'll get a monthly newsletter with all the opportunities that month. We actually had so many, we had to go to a monthly versus a quarterly. So there's plenty of opportunities for patients to engage.
Thank you. And I'd just echo that too. Sign up for Creaky Joints newsletter and you'll find plenty of information. Feel free to contact me, of course, as well. And I can put you in touch with anybody on our research team or advocacy or education colleagues. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Lori to close us out. And thank you again, all three of our wonderful speakers. Lori, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I just really wanted to, say thank you, everyone, for all our speakers for joining us here today. I think it's just been really informative. I could just see this being so helpful to people, like not just the group who've attended, but others involved with our network who can look at this recording and learn a little bit more. And it really demystifies a lot of these steps in the process. I'd also like to just, talking about the newsletter or ways to get involved, you can see on this slide here that it shows all the ways to kind of, follow us on social media, whether that be Creaky Joints or CAPA, and you're more than welcome to do so. All the addresses are noted there, though I'm sure if you were to go on any one of these social media platforms, you'd be able to find both organizations quickly enough. So with that being said, I would like to just run that last poll one time just to see where folks are at. I'm gonna go, just bear with me here while I launch the second poll. And just let us know, how would you rate your level of knowledge now about getting drugs reimbursed in Canada? So feel free to enter your response here. Oh, it looks like, yeah, I see some significant movement here, just looking at the polling towards like intermediate from the very little, many people had noted very little at the beginning. Here I can share some results, but this is just lovely to hear, just kind of eyeballing the results. It's really nice to hear that it's this has been helpful to folks and hopefully will be to others as well. So with that, I will close things off, and I thank you all very much for taking a moment out of your evening to attend this session or to speak. So thanks so much.